September 18, 1944. A monsoon storm smothered the jungle ridges of Peleliu. Rain hammered steel helmets and turned the earth into black mud. In the darkness between lightning strikes, a Japanese night patrol moved forward in absolute silence, bare feet in the wet leaves, rifles wrapped to mute the clatter, breath held tight in disciplined rhythm. The island had taught them one truth above all others: the night always belonged to Japan. Then, without warning, the jungle began to kill them. One man dropped without a sound. No flash. No flare. No warning shot. Seconds later, another collapsed behind him. Panic rippled through the patrol. Men fired blindly into the trees, bullets slicing through empty rain. They could hear nothing. See nothing. Yet their comrades kept falling, methodical, precise, invisible. Survivors later swore they saw it. Not light. Not fire. But eyes watching from inside the darkness itself. By dawn, terrified reports raced through Japanese radio channels. Officers whispered of a new American curse. Something that could see without being seen. Something that hunted in a realm where no human vision should exist. Among the ranks, a name spread in trembling voices. The demon-eyed. And for the first time in the Pacific War, Japan began to fear the dark. Long before the whispers of demon-eyed soldiers reached Peleliu, American infantry had already learned a brutal truth across the Pacific: victory under the sun meant nothing once darkness fell. In the choking jungles of the Bismarck Archipelago, along flooded river crossings in northern New Guinea, and across the tangled ridgelines of isolated island airstrips, U.S. forces discovered that Japan did not fight the same war after sunset. By day, American artillery flattened positions and aircraft ruled the sky. But at night, all that power vanished. The battlefield shrank to the range of a whisper. And in that void, Japan thrived. The attacks came without warning. Small groups slipped through the perimeter, 3 men, sometimes 5, moving barefoot through mud and wet leaves. They cut communication wires with surgical precision. A single grenade dropped into a machine gun pit could undo an entire defensive line. A knife across one sentry's throat opened a path for dozens more. By the time American flares lit the ground, the attackers were already gone, melting back into the jungle like spirits. The physical damage was often limited. The psychological damage was catastrophic. Men stopped trusting the dark. Sleep became impossible. Entire platoons lay awake for nights at a time with fingers locked around triggers, flinching at every rustle of wind through palm fronds. Exhaustion blurred judgment. Accidental discharges claimed lives. Shadows became enemies. Veterans later said the mind broke long before the body did. Private Daniel Harker, a fictionalized composite of hundreds of terrified infantrymen, later described the nights as watching the jungle breathe. He said the leaves moved even when the air was still. That the silence felt intentional. That every foxhole felt like a grave waiting to be filled. Commanders began to realize what their maps and after-action reports could not fully capture: Japan was not trying to win at night through firepower. They were winning through fear. The statistics told the story in fragments. Entire battalions advancing miles in daylight, only to lose cohesion after a single night of infiltration. Radios lost. Officers killed in their sleep. Ammunition dumps destroyed without a shot fired in return. Night after night, the same pattern unfolded. To the American High Command, this was unacceptable. The United States could outproduce, outgun, and outmaneuver any enemy, but it could not outfight what it could not see. Every Pacific island became 2 separate battles. One fought in daylight. One fought in terror. By mid-1944, frontline commanders were sending increasingly desperate reports to their superiors. Soldiers were breaking under the strain. Some units requested to hold ground only during daylight. Others refused to advance into jungle corridors known for night infiltration. The darkness itself had become a weapon. And the most terrifying truth of all was this: nothing in the American arsenal could stop it. Searchlights exposed friendly positions. Flares blinded everyone equally. Machine gun fire consumed ammunition but hit only shadows. The more aggressively Americans tried to dominate the night, the more visible and vulnerable they became. The U.S. Army was winning the war by the map. But it was losing it by the hour after sunset. Something had to change. Or the night would keep on killing. To understand why the night had become so deadly for American soldiers, one had to look inside the Japanese way of war, long before U.S. troops ever set foot on those islands. For the Imperial Japanese Army, darkness was not a limitation. It was a discipline. Years before Pearl Harbor, units assigned to jungle and island warfare trained in total blackness. Recruits were forced to move for hours at night without speaking, without lights, without leaving tracks. They memorized terrain by touch and sound. They learned to judge distance by the echo of a footstep. Officers taught them to feel the presence of an enemy through disturbances in the air, the rhythm of breathing, the unnatural stillness of a man trying not to move. Night combat was not treated as an extension of daytime fighting. It was considered an art of predation. Japanese doctrine rejected the idea of overwhelming firepower after dark. Noise was failure. Speed was secondary to invisibility. A successful raid was one in which the enemy never understood what had happened until morning. Soldiers were drilled to move in staggered files, communicating with taps, rope tugs, and barely audible whispers. Every man learned to fight with bayonet, knife, and grenade at arm's length. More importantly, they were trained to endure fear until it no longer existed. Officers told their men that Americans depended on machines, light, and noise. That once those advantages vanished, the enemy would become blind and confused. The Japanese soldier was taught that he alone possessed the will to fight in a world without visibility. And on dozens of islands, that belief was proven again and again. Captured American positions told the story. Radio sets sliced apart. Phone lines cut clean. Maps and documents stolen in silence. Entire platoons woken by screams that ended just as quickly as they began. Japanese commanders learned to time their raids not for destruction alone, but for maximum psychological damage. They waited until the deepest hours of the night, when exhaustion dulled reflexes and sentries struggled to stay awake. One successful infiltration, even with limited casualties, could paralyze an entire sector for days. And it worked. After each night attack, American patrols moved slower. Foxholes were dug deeper. Men fired at every sound. Supplies were burned in defensive fires. Morale eroded one whisper at a time. The jungle itself seemed to fight alongside the Emperor's soldiers. By 1944, Japanese field commanders held complete confidence in this invisible battlefield. They knew they could not match American production. They could not win artillery duels. They could not challenge U.S. air supremacy. But at night, those monsters of modern war became useless hunks of metal. In darkness, it came down to who could remain unseen longer. And for 3 brutal years, Japan had proven that answer belonged to them. So when fresh American units arrived on forward islands with new equipment and renewed resolve, Japanese officers saw no reason to change their doctrine. They sharpened their blades. Rehearsed their silent drills. Chose their infiltration routes through mangrove swamps, coral ridges, and jungle ravines. To them, night warfare was not risky. It was routine. They did not know, in hidden corners of American bases far from the front, a small group of engineers was preparing to challenge the oldest battlefield truth in human history. That the dark belonged to those willing to disappear inside it. While American infantry bled in the darkness of the Pacific, the answer to their terror did not begin on the battlefield at all. It began in a place that did not appear on any map. On a remote supply base carved into coral and steel somewhere beyond the main shipping lanes, the U.S. Army had quietly assembled a small, mismatched detachment of specialists. Signal engineers. Electronics technicians. Battlefield medics. And at the center of them all, a young civilian optics expert pulled from a university lab and given a rank he neither wanted nor understood. His assignment was simple in words, and nearly impossible in reality. Give American soldiers a way to see in absolute darkness. Early attempts had failed miserably. Searchlights only turned defenders into targets. Flares blinded both sides. Experimental luminous paints worked for seconds before fading into useless glow. Every solution still relied on light that the enemy could also see. The core problem remained unsolved. Visibility always worked both ways. The breakthrough idea, still treated like science fiction even by the men building it, came from a question the young optics specialist asked during a late-night briefing. What if the enemy could never see the light at all? He proposed working in a spectrum invisible to the naked human eye, light that illuminated only for a specially tuned receiver. In theory, soldiers could flood the battlefield with this hidden illumination and remain completely unseen by the enemy. In practice, no one had successfully built such a system compact enough to be carried into jungle combat. The first prototypes were disasters. Delicate glass tubes shattered during transport. Power units overheated in tropical humidity. Test operators stumbled blindly, tangled in cables, collapsing under the combined weight of weapon, battery, and shielding. During one early field test, a prototype shorted out in a rainstorm and burned through its own wiring harness in a spray of sparks. The project nearly ended that night. But the battlefield reports kept coming in. More night raids. More infiltrations. More dead sentries. High command grew impatient. The engineers were told bluntly that if they could not produce a usable system, the project would be buried and forgotten as a failed experiment. Then, quietly, one final prototype emerged. It was crude. Heavy. Imperfect. But it worked. The device mounted an experimental optical tube atop a standard-issue American rifle. Beneath the barrel sat a filtered illumination source that cast no visible beam. The power unit was carried in a reinforced backpack that hummed faintly when active. Through the optic, however, the invisible world suddenly glowed into view, shapes, movement, heat signatures rendered in a faint, ghostly contrast. The image was grainy, distorted at the edges. But it was vision in total darkness. Field tests were conducted in layers of secrecy. Selected soldiers were blindfolded and led into sealed training zones. Targets moved silently through brush and tall grass while the operators tracked them through their strange new lenses. At first the men laughed nervously. Then the laughter stopped. The impossible had become routine in a matter of minutes. One tester later described the sensation as lifting a veil off the night. Yet no one celebrated. The engineers knew what the rifle could do. But they also knew what it could not. The power units drained quickly. Rain reduced clarity. The optics were fragile. Every advantage came with a cost. This was not a miracle weapon. It was a gamble. And now the gamble was being rushed into war. Orders arrived sealed and stamped for immediate deployment. A limited number of systems would be issued to a carefully selected detachment of infantrymen already stationed near active infiltration zones. The soldiers were told almost nothing, only that they would carry a new experimental site into the most dangerous hours of the night. Most of them assumed it would fail like so many other miracles promised by rumor and desperation. None of them yet understood what it would look like to the enemy. And none of the Japanese commanders preparing their next silent raids had the faintest idea that the darkness they trusted had already been quietly taken from them. The men who were chosen to carry the new device into combat did not receive inspiring speeches or confident promises. They were simply handed a strange collection of equipment and told, in guarded language, that it might change the way the war was fought at night. The core of the system looked deceptively simple, a reinforced experimental optical tube mounted above a standard American service rifle, its glass shielded by a thick, rubberized casing. Beneath the barrel rested a compact illumination unit that emitted no visible beam. To the naked eye, the device appeared completely dark and inactive. But a heavy cable ran from the weapon to a battery pack built into a canvas and metal backpack, weighing nearly as much as a radio set. When the system was powered on, the user heard only a faint electrical hum. There was no glow, no flash, no visible sign that anything had changed. Only through the optic did the transformation occur. Inside the lens, the night rearranged itself into a shimmering world of soft contrasts. Jungle grass separated from jungle shadow. Tree trunks emerged from black mist. Distant movement appeared as pale, shifting forms where human eyes would see nothing at all. The image lacked sharp clarity and wavered at the edges, but it revealed what had never been visible before: motion without light. The engineers warned the operators of its limitations immediately. The batteries drained rapidly and had to be rotated every few hours. Humidity blurred the internal optics. Rain beaded on the lens and distorted the image unless wiped constantly. The system could short if submerged. And the added weight slowed movement, especially in jungle terrain. Every advantage demanded discipline and endurance. Yet even with its flaws, the effect was undeniable. During final training exercises, men tracked silent runners through tall grass at distances no patrol had ever managed before. They followed crawling figures completely hidden to unaided eyes. They watched enemy silhouettes form up beyond the effective range of flares and tripwires. For the first time, the Americans were not reacting to the night. They were entering it already informed. The operators themselves quickly adopted a dark humor about their new burden. Some called the optic ghost glass. Others, less kindly, called it the hump from hell. The battery carriers jokingly referred to themselves as walking lightning rods. But beneath the joke sat a growing realization: if the device performed in combat the way it did in training, nothing on the battlefield would ever be the same. What none of them yet knew was how the enemy would interpret it. To Japanese soldiers trained to believe that true warriors vanished into darkness, the idea that an enemy could see without light was unthinkable. Their entire doctrine rested on invisibility. On the certainty that after sunset, the battlefield belonged to the unseen. The American engineers foresaw only part of that reaction. They understood the weapon's tactical value. They did not fully grasp the psychological shock it would inflict on an army built around shadow and silence. The final preparations were rushed. Each system was carefully zeroed and sealed against moisture. Extra batteries were packed and distributed. The small detachment chosen to carry the weapons was quietly briefed and reassigned to forward sectors known for heavy infiltration. No official designation followed them into the field. On shipping manifests, the equipment was listed simply as optical experimental units. To the men carrying them, it was a burden they hoped might keep them alive. And to the enemy who would first encounter it, it would soon become something far more disturbing, a power that seemed to peer directly through the night itself. Within days, Japanese infiltration units would once again move forward with total confidence. And for the first time in the Pacific War, they would advance into a darkness that no longer protected them. The night chosen for the first live combat test could not have favored the Japanese more. A thick blanket of fog rolled in from the sea, swallowing the ridgelines and mangrove flats in a shifting gray wall. There was no moon, no stars, only the constant low hiss of rain moving through the jungle canopy. To Japanese commanders, it was perfect terrain for infiltration. To American infantrymen digging shallow foxholes along a defensive perimeter, it felt like a sentence already passed. Shortly after midnight, the first movement began. A forward Japanese assault element slipped out from the tree line in staggered files, barefoot, rifles wrapped in cloth, packs stripped down to silence. They moved exactly as they had been trained, slow, patient, invisible. Their aim was not a firefight. It was confusion. Command posts to be cut. Machine gun nests to be silenced with grenades. Death to arrive quietly, before anyone understood it was there. Inside the American perimeter, the experimental detachment was already awake. Battery carriers crouched low behind sandbags and tree roots, hands resting on the humming power packs. The operators lay prone with their rifles braced against logs, faces pressed to unfamiliar glass. When the switches were thrown, nothing changed to the naked eye. The jungle remained black and endless. But inside the optics, the battlefield awakened. The fog became a soft, luminous curtain. Grass glowed faintly. Tree trunks emerged as pale pillars. And more than 100 yards out, human shapes appeared, dark silhouettes moving steadily forward where no human eye should have seen anything at all. The lead operator tracked the closest figure as it crawled through wet fern leaves. He could see the rise and fall of shoulders with each careful breath. He waited, steady, disciplined, until the figure reached open ground. At 70 yards, he fired. The shot cracked once through the stillness. The crawling silhouette collapsed and did not rise again. Behind it, 2 more figures froze in confusion. They heard a rifle report, but saw no muzzle flash, no flare, no source. One raised his weapon and fired blindly into the fog. The second turned to whisper a warning that never came. 2 more shots echoed. Both men fell. Across the perimeter, the same scenes unfolded simultaneously. Figures that believed themselves invisible were suddenly dropping in the open, one by one, without understanding how. Japanese soldiers pressed closer to the ground, certain that if they simply stayed still, they would vanish again. They did not realize they were already fully exposed. One enemy officer attempted to rally his men, rising to direct the assault forward. Through the optic, his gestures were unmistakable. A single round struck him squarely, and his body toppled backward into the mud. The men who had depended on his orders hesitated fatally. Panic began to spread. Some units fired wildly into the jungle, expending ammunition at shadows that were no longer empty. Others turned and ran, convinced they were being hunted by something they could not fight. Grenades meant for American bunkers exploded harmlessly in open ground as their throwers were cut down mid-motion. Within minutes, the infiltration had collapsed. American commanders, watching the chaos unfold through relay reports, authorized limited counterfire. Mortars were walked carefully onto groups of retreating silhouettes that only the experimental teams could see. Explosions tore through enemy withdrawal routes that moments earlier had seemed perfectly hidden. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Japanese were being ambushed in their own element. By the time dawn thinned the fog, the ground before the American line told a story no report could soften. The bodies lay far from any visible defensive position. No flares had illuminated them. No searchlights had betrayed the Americans. To the surviving Japanese soldiers who crawled back through the jungle in terror, only one explanation seemed possible. The Americans had learned to see through the dark. Interrogations in the following days confirmed the shock. Prisoners spoke of men collapsing without warning. Of officers shouting commands to soldiers already dead. Of feeling watched from directions that did not exist. One shaken corporal insisted that the Americans' eyes themselves had glowed in the fog. By the third night, the nickname had spread through multiple Japanese units in hushed tones. Demon-eyed. The American operators did not hear the name at first. They only knew that for the first time in months, they had fought through a night without losing a single man to infiltration. They had not fired wildly. They had not flung up flares in panic. They had not waited helplessly for dawn. They had controlled the darkness. And as the sun rose over the battered jungle, both sides understood that something fundamental had changed, though only one side yet grasped how permanent that change would be. The damage inflicted that night could not be measured only in bodies. By the following morning, Japanese field radios carried a different kind of traffic than commanders were used to hearing. Reports no longer spoke only of enemy strength or artillery fire. Now they spoke of confusion, invisibility, and fear. Units that had never failed in night operations were asking for clarification. Others were requesting permission to delay further infiltration attacks until the nature of the new American capability could be understood. Some messages were barely coherent. Soldiers described men falling without seeing their attacker. Patrol leaders reported being targeted from directions that made no tactical sense. Several units claimed that Americans were firing with perfect accuracy from positions that could not possibly see them. Officers attempted to calm their troops, insisting that fear and exhaustion were creating illusions. But the explanations rang hollow. The raid slowed. A strategy that had once felt invincible suddenly appeared dangerous. In some sectors, infiltration teams simply refused to advance into areas where the WWII had been reported. Veterans who had once moved confidently through darkness now hesitated at the tree line, scanning a night that no longer felt protective. Discipline cracked under uncertainty. Japanese commanders tried to restore pressure through harsh measures, threats, punishments, orders to advance regardless of losses. But fear works faster than command. And for the first time in the Pacific War, the darkness itself had turned hostile to them. Meanwhile, on the American side of the line, an equally dramatic transformation was taking place. Men who had spent months sleeping in brief, terrified fragments now rested through entire nights without jumping at every sound. Sentries remained alert, but no longer frozen with dread. Patrols, once reduced to cautious daylight movements, began to push outward after sunset with renewed confidence. The jungle that had once felt alive with enemies now felt, for the first time, observable. American morale surged. The knowledge that somewhere along the perimeter invisible eyes were watching changed everything. Even soldiers who never touched the experimental weapons felt their presence. Fear loosened its grip. Exhaustion eased. Confidence returned to movements that had once been governed only by survival. Strategically, the effect was immediate. Japanese commanders were forced to abandon the very tactic that had compensated for their disadvantages in artillery, air power, and logistics. Night no longer offered the concealment they depended on. Raids became rare. When they did occur, they were cautious, fragmented, and far less effective. The psychological edge that had once belonged entirely to Japan slipped away in a matter of days. American units reclaimed the initiative. Supply lines stabilized. Communications repair teams worked through the night without constant interruption. Machine gun crews no longer waited for unseen attackers to appear at their flanks. The battlefield's invisible half, the half that had drained strength and broken nerves for years, was slowly being brought under control. And perhaps most importantly of all, the story began to travel. From foxhole to foxhole, from unit to unit, soldiers whispered that the Americans had finally stolen the night itself. That the jungle no longer hid enemies as it once had. That the WWII were watching. For many Japanese troops, the belief that darkness made them untouchable had been stitched into their training, their confidence, their very understanding of war. Now that belief was unraveling. And an army that no longer trusts its greatest advantage soon finds itself fighting in daylight, against an enemy who has never feared being seen. The WWII operators were never celebrated in headlines. Their weapons were never paraded through victory marches or showcased in public speeches. Officially, their mission was classified, absorbed quietly into after-action reports and locked behind layers of wartime secrecy. To the wider world, the Nights of Terror simply seemed to fade away. But on those forgotten jungle ridges, something ancient had been broken. For centuries, darkness had belonged to the bold, the hidden, and the patient. In the Pacific War, it had belonged to Japan. Then, in a matter of nights, American ingenuity rewrote that rule. Not with overwhelming firepower. Not with massed armor or roaring aircraft. But with invisible light and a handful of soldiers willing to carry the future on their backs. The war would end before the WWII system could spread across the entire Pacific. Atomic fire would close the chapter first. Yet the idea born in secrecy did not die with the jungle campaigns. It evolved. Improved. Refined. Passed quietly from one generation of soldiers to the next. From Korea to Vietnam, and into every modern battlefield since. Today, no professional army enters combat without some way to see through darkness. Every night vision optic, every shadow-breaking scope, traces its lineage back to those first silent experiments that taught Americans how to hunt without being seen. For the soldiers who once lay awake in terror after sunset, this change meant more than victory. It meant sleep. It meant survival. It meant the end of a fear that had haunted them night after night. And somewhere in the Pacific jungle, the night itself lost a war it had ruled for generations. If you've ever heard stories of night fighting from a veteran in your family, share them in the comments. And for more untold World War II stories of hidden weapons and forgotten battles, make sure to like this video and subscribe.